Everyday injuries occur on the job. These injuries may be preventable by simply wearing personal protective equipment, wearing it properly, and knowing when to wear it. Personal protective equipment, or PPE, is part of your employer's program to keep you safe. In this program, we will examine the use of many different types of PPE. The program is designed for employees who encounter workplace conditions that may be hazardous to health or body. These workplace hazards could require the use of PPE. This video will discuss when PPE is needed, who provides PPE in the workplace, OSHA's training requirements for PPE, and types of PPE. Although this program is an introduction to PPE, it cannot be a complete guide to PPE. Please consult with your employer as to specific workplace requirements. PPE is designed as any specialized clothing or equipment worn by an individual employee for protection against a hazard. PPE can be as simple as a hard hat to a complex breathing apparatus as part of a hazardous material suit. An employee who must use PPE in the workplace because of a hazard assessment is called an affected employee. OSHA requires the use of PPE to reduce employee exposure to hazards when other workplace controls, such as engineering and administrative, are not feasible or effective in reducing the exposure to acceptable levels. Employers are required to determine if PPE should be used to protect their workers. Regulation 29 CFR 1910.132 covers PPE and provides the guidelines that employers must follow in determining requirements. Specific PPE, such as eye and face protection, respiratory protection, head protection, and others, are addressed in separate standards in the OSHA manual. Other OSHA standards, such as hazard communications, blood-borne pathogens, electrical work practices, and permit-required confined spaces require the use of certain PPE as it pertains to that particular topic. A good example is the PPE section of material safety data sheets, which are required as part of the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard. OSHA has mandated that employers must pay for the protective equipment, including personal protective equipment that is used to comply with OSHA standards in the workplace. Regardless of the PPE being used, OSHA requires it to be used and maintained in a sanitary and reliable condition. In addition, the PPE must be of safe design, reliable, and constructed for the work to be performed. When employees bring their own PPE to the job site, the employer is responsible to make sure the PPE is adequate for the job and for the proper maintenance and sanitation of the PPE. Employers are only responsible to provide the minimum level of PPE necessary to comply with the workplace requirements. If the employer decides to use upgraded PPE to meet these requirements, they must also pay for that PPE. If an employee asks to use a different PPE than that provided by the employer, and the employer decides to allow him or her to do so, the employer is not required to pay for the item. An employee's use of PPE they own must be completely voluntary, and the PPE must meet the minimum requirements set by the employer. OSHA made a few exceptions when the employer does not have to pay for PPE. Protective equipment employers are not required to pay for. Ordinary safety toe footwear and ordinary prescription safety eyewear, as long as the employee is allowed to wear these items off the job site. Shoes with integrated metatarsal protection, as long as they provide and pay for metatarsal guards that are attached to the shoes. Logging boots, but leaves the responsibility for payment open to employer and employee negotiations. Everyday clothing such as long sleeve shirts, long pants, street shoes, normal work boots, and other similar types of clothing. Replacement PPE when an employee has lost or intentionally damaged PPE issued to him or her. Employees may be required to pay for such replacement. However, employers are required to pay for replacement or upgraded PPE used to comply with OSHA standards. The employer must conduct a hazard assessment of each work area to determine if hazards exist or are likely to exist. This assessment must be conducted by the employer to determine the level of hazard and be certified by the person performing the assessment. The certification of the assessment must be written and include the dates of the assessment. If conditions change, then a new certified assessment must be performed. Engineering and workplace controls must be used to eliminate and reduce hazards before relying on and using personal protective equipment. PPE is considered the last line of defense in the control of hazards. A commonly used practice, referred to as hierarchy of controls, is effective for addressing hazardous risk. Start at the top and see if the hazard can be controlled with engineering controls, taking the employee out of the equation. Then factor the employee back in by changing the way they work, how long they work, and using PPE. The hazard assessment should be conducted by the company safety officer or other qualified individual to identify the sources of hazards. Hazard should be determined by assessing the tasks involved, the employee performing the tasks, and/or group of employees, especially if the group perform identical tasks. Basic hazard categories that should be considered include, but are not limited to, impact, penetration, compression, heat, harmful dust, and light optical radiation. All sources for hazards should be identified and recorded. Look for high or low temperature sources that could result in burns, eye injury, ignition of protective equipment, heat-cold stress, or frostbite. Sources of chemical exposure. Sources of hazardous dust or particulates. Sources of light radiation, such as from welding, brazing, cutting, heat treating, lasers, metal halide lamps. Sources of falling objects or potential for falling objects. Sources of sharp objects which might pierce the feet or cut the hands. Sources of rolling or pinching objects which could crush the feet. Sources of any electrical hazards. Pay close attention how the layout of the facility affects each worker and co-workers and even visitors walking by. The data and information obtained during the walkthrough should be organized and analyzed to enable proper selection of PPE. Each hazard should be reviewed and a determination made as to the type, level of risk, and seriousness of potential injury from each hazard found. The possibility of multiple hazards occurring simultaneously must also be considered. If hazards exist or are likely to exist, then the employer must provide PPE that will protect the affected employee from the hazards identified in the assessment, communicate selection decisions to each affected employee, and select PPE that properly fits each affected employee, and assure that the employee uses the PPE. OSHA regulations require the employer to provide training for each employee who performs tasks that require the use of PPE. Training is to cover the use of the PPE and its limitations. Each affected employee must demonstrate a satisfactory understanding of the training and the ability to use PPE properly. This requirement must be met before the employee is allowed to perform the work that requires PPE use. Employees must understand when PPE is necessary, what PPE is necessary, the limitations of the PPE, how to properly put on, take off, adjust, wear, and inspect PPE, and the proper care, maintenance, useful life, and disposal of PPE. The employer is required to retrain employees when changes in the workplace render previous training obsolete or when the job requirements change and the PPE type changes. If an affected employee's knowledge or use of assigned PPE indicates that the employee has not retained a satisfactory understanding of the training or the necessary skills, they must be retrained. All training must be verified and should state that each affected employee has received and understood the required training via written certification. The certificate should contain the name of each affected employee trained, date of the training, and subject of the training. Employers must provide eye and face protection for employees who work in areas that contain the risk of eye injury. The eye protection must pass ANSI Z87.1-1989 requirements as a minimum. Employees who wear prescription lenses must wear protective devices that incorporate the prescription in its design or wear eye protection designed to be worn over the prescription eyewear, such as goggles. Eye protection is provided in many forms for better protection from the different hazards. Safety glasses are made with either metal or plastic frames and are used for moderate impact from particles produced from carpentry, grinding, scaling, etc. Most tasks require the glasses to have a side guard. Goggles protect eyes and the surrounding facial area from impact, dust, and splashes. Welding shields protect the eyes from burns caused by infrared or intense radiant light. The shield also protects the face and eyes from flying sparks, metal spatter, and slag chips produced during welding, brazing, soldering, and cutting. Face shields do not protect employees from hard impact hazards. However, hazardous liquids, nuisance dusts, and potential splashes are kept away from the face. Respiratory protection is an important part of PPE. Respirators protect the lungs from atmospheres contaminated with harmful dust, fogs, fumes, mists, gases, smokes, sprays, or vapors. Contaminated atmospheres should always be first prevented by engineering control measures before the use of respirators. Respirator use should always be the last resort. The employer must provide the respiratory protection gear required for the atmosphere the employee is going to work in. A dust mask or filter facepiece are negative pressure particulate respirators with a filter as an integral part of the facepiece, or the entire facepiece is composed of the filtering medium. These masks provide the least protection of any respirator and are the least sophisticated. Different masks have different degrees of filtering capabilities. The instructions on the mask will tell how efficient the mask is. An APR, or air purifying respirators, contain a purifying filter cartridge or canister that removes specific contaminants by passing ambient air through the air purifying element. An ASR, or atmosphere supplying respirator, has an independent source of breathing air supplied to the respirator. Two types of atmosphere supplying respirators are SARs and SCBAs. An SAR, or supplied air respirator, has an air source that is a distance away from the employee and is supplied by a hose. The user is limited by the length of the hose. An SCBA, or self-contained breathing apparatus, is a mobile unit that is designed to be carried by the user. Air tanks must contain a minimum of 30 minutes of breathing air. An employer must provide training on the respirator and have a satisfactory respiratory program as required by OSHA. This program includes fit testing and medically qualifying all employees before they ever use a respirator. Before each use, respirators should be fit tested. The facepiece should seal around the jaw and face. Any facial hair that prevents a tight seal must be shaved. A tight seal prevents contaminated air from entering the mask and being inhaled by the employee. Be aware of the limitations of a respirator, why it is necessary, how to use it properly, procedures for maintenance and storage, and how to recognize medical signs and symptoms that may limit or prevent effective use. Each affected employee must wear a protective helmet when working in areas where there is a potential for injury to the head from falling objects or from low clearances. The employer is responsible for providing the necessary hard hat for the job. Head protection is divided into 3 classes: Class C, E, and G. Class G hard hats, which were formerly Class A, are for general service such as mining, building construction, lumbering, and manufacturing. This class provides good impact protection, but limited voltage protection only up to 2200 volts. Class E hard hats, which were formerly Class B, are manufactured for tasks around high voltage lines. The Class E hard hat will protect against falling objects, electrical shock, and burns. It provides voltage protection for the wearer up to 20,000 volts. Class C hard hats are designed for comfort and limited protection against bumps, but not falling objects. These are sometimes referred to as bump hats. Hard hats provide features that protect the head from impact by providing a hard shell that resists and deflects objects from hitting the head. The suspension system inside the hat acts as a shock absorber against falling objects. Some hard hats insulate against electrical shock. A metal hard hat is outlawed at most construction sites and facilities since it offers no electrical protection. Hard hats shield your scalp, face, neck, and shoulders against falling fluids. Some can be modified by attaching face shields, goggles, hoods, or hearing protection. It is the employer's responsibility to ensure hard hats provide sufficient protection. Hard hats should be removed from service if the suspension system shows signs of wear or no longer holds the shell away from the head. Inspect hard hats before each use for cracks or deformations. Never wear a cracked or deformed hard hat. Limit use of paints or stickers on a hard hat shell, which can hide signs of deterioration. Although it is good practice to clean hard hats, some cleaning agents, solvents, and paints can compromise the integrity of the shell as well as eliminate electrical resistance. Follow manufacturer's recommendations for cleaning. Employers are responsible for ensuring that employees wear foot protection when working in areas that contain potential for foot injury due to falling, rolling, or piercing objects. Foot protection must comply with ANSI Z41-1991 as a minimum. Make sure your shoes fit properly. Safety shoes are always recommended, including steel toes in certain cases. Depending on the task, it is important to wear shoes with impact-resistant toes and heat-resistant soles that protect against falling objects and hot surfaces. Wearing metal insoles will protect your foot against puncture wounds, and rubber or synthetic rubber soles will provide protection against electrical conduction hazards. There are many injuries that can happen to the hands. OSHA requires the employer to provide hand protection appropriate for the job. Gloves come in a variety of types and sizes. Different gloves protect the hands from different hazards. Choose the glove appropriate for the job. Cotton gloves offer protection against dirt, grease, and paint while letting the hands breathe. Some are dipped in PVC to allow better grip on objects. Leather gloves are made from a variety of different hides. They offer varying levels of protection from abrasions and offer flexibility and better grip. Plastic gloves, such as latex, neoprene, nitrile, and PVC, protect the hands from chemicals, fluids, and cuts, as well as providing flexibility and durability. Gloves should be inspected before each use for cuts, cracks, holes, and tears. If any of these exist, the gloves should be thrown away and replaced. Specialty lineman's gloves are to be worn around electrical hazards. These gloves provide protection from electrical shock. Body protection is designed to avert physical and health hazards from the body. There are many types of body protection, such as laboratory coats, aprons, coveralls, bodysuits, and vests. Body protection provides resistance to cuts, splashes of hot metal or liquids, impact from tools, material, and machinery, hazardous chemicals, and radiation. Heat stress is a major concern for employers whose employees wear certain types of body protection, especially when worn in hot environments. Heat stress can be dangerous. Always be aware of the symptoms of heat stress when working in hot environments or with body protection. Always be aware of your surroundings when wearing body protection. Body protection can sometimes have loose parts that can get caught in machinery. It is important to keep those parts of the body protection away from moving machinery. Exposure to excessive noise depends on several factors. How loud is the noise as measured in decibels? What is the duration of exposure to the noise? Is the noise generated from multiple sources or a single source? The general rule is that the louder the noise, the shorter the exposure time before hearing protection must be provided. OSHA requires hearing protection if employees are exposed to 85 decibels or greater. If you cannot hear a fellow employee in an area without shouting, then you probably need to be wearing hearing protection in that area. Ear muff, ear plugs, and canal caps are some examples of hearing protection. Ear muffs fit over both ears and reduce noise 15 to 30 decibels depending on how they are manufactured and fit. Earplugs are inserted into the ear and completely block the canal. Earplugs reduce the noise 15 to 30 decibels depending on manufacture and fit. Cotton is not considered an acceptable hearing protection device. PPE must be inspected before each use by the affected employee. Regular cleaning, maintenance, repairs, unless the PPE is disposable, and replacement of PPE must follow manufacturers and your employer's directions. It is recommended that maintenance records be kept for each article of PPE. Store PPE in appropriate storage devices, such as specially marked cabinets or closets when not in use. Proper storage procedures will prevent damage to PPE due to dust, moisture, sunlight, damaging chemicals, extreme temperature, and impact. PPE should be stored separately from street clothes to avoid cross-contamination. Potentially contaminated PPE should be cleaned and stored in a well-ventilated space with plenty of breathing room around each item. Store different levels of PPE separately to prevent issuing the wrong items by mistake. Personal protective equipment is designed to protect employees from workplace hazards that can cause injury or illness. OSHA requires the employer to implement a written hazard assessment program. Written certification of the hazard assessment should identify the workplace evaluated, the person certifying that the assessment has been performed, and dates of the hazard assessment. OSHA Regulation 29 CFR 1910.132F